Ielts Academic, Writing Task 1, Lecture. Hi, my name's Jay and I'm going to show you a template that you can use in your Writing Task 1. The template satisfies the criteria that the examiners are looking for. It will save you time and it will increase your scores. If you memorize the template before test day, you will know exactly what to do as soon as the examiner says you can start writing. This lecture is also going to be interactive, so get out a piece of paper and a pen and follow along with me. By the end, you will have written a top-scoring Writing Task 1, and by writing it, you will have helped to memorize the template. This is what we're going to write. It has 4 sections. The first section is a short introduction. The second section is a general description of the trends. The third section is a comparison of the data. And the last section is a single sentence summary. We'll look at each part one by one. Part 1. Introduce the graph. Introducing the graph is incredibly simple. All you need to do is to rewrite the first sentence of the task description in your own words. Here is an example task description. It's the box of text that sits on top of the graph. The box comprises 2 sentences. You need to focus on the first sentence, which says, "The graph shows the availability of various sweeteners in the USA from 1966 to 2012. Pause the video and rewrite this sentence. It should only take you a minute or 2. We'll then look at my answer. So the original sentence says, "The graph shows the availability of various sweeteners in the USA from 1966 to 2012. I've rewritten this in my own words to say, the given line graph represents how much sweetener was available in the United States over a 45-year period. If we compare mine with the original, you can see that I've just changed the words using similar words, also called synonyms. Shows, represents. The availability of various sweeteners, how much sweetener was available. In the USA, in the United States, from 1966 to 2012, over a 45-year period." My sentence says exactly the same thing as the original, but in different words. That's how you should introduce your graph. Part 2. Describe general trends. In this part, you need to describe the general trends of the graph. Don't use the y-axis yet, but you can use the x-axis. In other words, describe the trends over time. Try and take a bird's eye view of the overall trends over the time period. Look at the total, the green line. What's the overall trend over the period? Look at refined cane and beet sugars, the blue line. What's the overall trend over this period? Look at corn sweeteners, the orange line. What's the overall trend over the period? Look at honey and edible syrups, the yellow and grey lines. What's the overall trend over the period? Pause the video and spend a couple of minutes describing the trends over the time period. Ask yourself, do the trends increase? Do they decrease? Do they fluctuate? Do they remain stable? Don't use the y-axis just yet. Here's what I wrote. In total, sweetener availability increased until around the year 2000 before it receded. The amount of refined cane and beet sugars decreased and then plateaued. Corn sweeteners increased consistently until 1982 and then steadied before beginning to fall from around 1999. The availability of honey and edible syrups remained relatively low and stable over the period. Let's now look at part 3. Part 3, compare the data. Now we want to compare the lines. Very simply, we want to say the blue line did this while the orange line did this, and the yellow line did this while the grey line did this. We want to use both the time period and the pounds per person to say what happened and when. In other words, use both the y-axis and the x-axis. So, I want you to compare refined cane and beet sugars with corn sweeteners. And I want you to compare honey with edible syrups. How do they compare over time? Use both the y-axis and the x-axis. Pause the video and have a go. I'll show you my answer in a minute. Okay, here's what I wrote. Let's look at this sentence by sentence. From 1966 to 1985, refined cane and beet sugars and corn sweeteners followed a very different trajectory. The sugars started at around 100 pounds per person, while corn sweeteners started at around 18 pounds per person. By 1985, however, the two sweeteners met at approximately 62 pounds. From there, they diverged again before meeting again in 2007 at around 63 pounds. In contrast to sugars and sweeteners, honey and syrups barely changed. They started at around 15 pounds each, and by the end of the period were almost the same. Okay, getting there. That's the toughest part, and it requires a bit of practice. Now let's look at the final part. Part 4, summarize in a single sentence. In the last part, you need to write a single sentence summary. How you do this is you take a step back and you look at the graph in total and ask yourself what happened overall. Take a minute and write a single sentence answering this question. For this graph, you may want to focus on the green line, total. Here's what I wrote. Sweetener availability in the United States increased until around 1998 before decreasing moderately. Recap. Okay, so just a little bit more to go now. Let's look at the whole thing put together. It's 178 words and it does everything that the examiners want. We wrote an introduction by rewriting the task description in our own words. Then we described the general trends over time. In part 3, we compared relevant data by selecting two lines and showing how they moved. And in this part, we used numbers from the y-axis. Finally, we wrote a single sentence summary. Questions? Cool. So we have a couple of questions from our E2 users. The first question is from Syed from Saudi Arabia. He asks, in part 1, do you have to change every single word or can you use some words from the task description? Good question. The answer is that you should try to use synonyms to rewrite the task description into your own words, but sometimes there aren't synonyms, so it's okay to borrow a word or two from the task description. The next question is from Davisha from India. She asks, how do we know what lines to compare in part 3? Good question. This depends on the graph. You need to select trends that would be interesting and relevant to compare. It's really up to you to decide this, but you should be able to see visually the best lines to compare. e2language.com. This template will help you to achieve a top score. For more practice materials, lessons, feedback, tips and strategies, check out e2language.com. Thanks for watching.